Well, what is up, guys and gals? With my fantastic procrastination skills, I have decided to actually start posting for once, and today's topic is going to be regarding Italian tanks during the Second World War. As many of you saw, I released a video defending Italy and their performance during the Second World War, and I mentioned a little bit about armor. So today I've decided I'm actually going to get into it and give my reasonings as to why they weren't really that bad. Their armor really was not that bad. Now, of course, there's comparisons between the United States and Britain, things like that, which I will get into. But even then, there's some good defenses towards Italian armor. But let's get into it. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow. I'm joking. No, let's get into it and let's talk about it. So let's kind of talk about early Italian tank design. So Italy's first real try at a tank was a heavy tank called the Fiat 2000. This was built around World War I, and it carried a 65mm howitzer, which was fairly decent for the time, and it also had a bunch of machine guns around it, that sort of thing. Think of it like the Mark 1s and the Mark 4s used by the British. But they started basically just importing a bunch of Renault FTs. If you know about the FT-17, it was probably the most successful tank of the war. People talk about the Mark 1s and the Mark 4s, but really, in reality, the FT-17 was on top. They then started working on the Fiat 3000. The Fiat 3000 was basically just an FT-17. Like, I'm just being honest. And this was really all that they were working on in the 20s. Now, in 1930, the Cardin Lloyd tankettes were coming into Italy, and they were very, very interested in them. The Cardin Lloyd Mark V specifically. Now, or no, maybe it's the Mark VI. Mark V's and the Mark VIs, I believe. Basically, what ended up happening was the Italians were like, we want some. So they started making licensed copies designated CV-29, which would basically just be the CV-33 and the CV-35, which were tankettes, literally, that were just Cardin Lloyds. Now, these tankettes, I think, deserve some defense, because you have to think about the tactics and the doctrine of Italy during World War II. As I mentioned in my last video, they wanted to fight in the Alps. They wanted to fight in the Alps is what they thought was going to happen, and they were going to be fighting in trenches, which tankettes are perfect for. They're very light, they can move around, they're speedy, and you don't really need a massive armament on a tankette. Now, another design was the L6/40, and it basically just had a 20mm autocannon on it, and it was riveted. Here's the issue with rivets and bolts. The issue with the rivets and bolts is that whenever your tank is hit, or there's any significant pressure or anything along that sort onto the tank, the rivets start flying inside of the tank and are basically little bullets that kill your crew. We see this with the, for example, I believe it was the M3 Lee had this issue, which, if you don't know, it was called the Coffin for Seven Brothers, for this exact reason. Now, it was a fairly good recon tank. It was fairly effective during the war for what it was going up against, and I think, honestly, if you had seen the Italians invade Poland, if you had seen the Italians involved with the invasion of Poland alongside Germany, you would have seen truly the Italian tanks in their prime. I think they would have, first off, they would just destroy any TKS that came in their way. But even if the Polish released some of the few 7 TPs that they have, or the 10 TP, I think you would see the Italian tanks come out on top. Even some of the Vickers 6 tons that were being used by the Polish wouldn't really stand a chance. Now, the Fiat 3000, I'll go back to that. The Fiat 3000 was really the start of Italy's mass production of tanks. And the Italians learned a good bit of it. They learned that, one, machine guns aren't really what you want as a main armament on a tank. You want an anti-tank gun slash anti-infrastructure gun, light vehicle gun, that sort of thing. You want something that can take on other vehicles, because it's probably going to see a good bit of them, or other structures. Now, the Fiat 3000 did teach the Italians a good bit. But at the same time, it's very difficult when you are a country that is so agricultural. It becomes a very, very difficult thing to really produce a lot of tanks. And this is what we're going to see throughout really this whole video. Now let's talk about the M11/39. It was the first real medium tank that the Italians decided to produce, and it had a fairly decent armor. It had a 37mm gun, and it also had 2 machine guns. Now, you'll notice this with Italian tanks, they love their rivets. So it's also a riveted armored tank, which is great. The M11/39 it had a lot of influences with the Matilda 1 and the cruiser tanks used by Britain. Now, the Italians were having issues as well finding a turret that was really strong enough to hold I believe it was the M40 gun that the Italians wanted to use. It was a little 37mm gun, just kind of the usual around this time. The armor itself was about 30mm thick, and it was alright for the time. You had a V6 diesel engine, which, I bet that was fun to deal with. Now, this tank is really the start of Italy's medium tanks, and it gets an upgrade to the Carro Armato. Italians are gonna flame me in the comments. Now, the Carro Armato M13/40 is basically just to replace a lot of their old stuff. The Fiat L6/40s, the 3000s, and the M11/39s. This tank was produced in 1940. It was really Italy's first tank being produced during World War II. It weighed around 14 tons and had a 47mm gun instead of the 37. Now, it was decent at piercing armor, and it wasn't a bad tank at all. But once it really starts going up against its competition, such as, the Crusaders, the Valentines, even the Shermans, and the M3 Lees, is where you really start to see it fall. Now, the M14/41 was another design. Basically, just was an M13/40, but improved. Basically, just had a more powerful engine. It wasn't produced in very big numbers, like every Italian tank, but they tried, and I think we should really see that, and be a little nice to old Fatso Mussolini. Now, going into the M15/42 is another medium tank. By the way, most of these medium tanks look exactly the same. They basically had the same chassis. Now, these started being built in 1943. It had a 47mm gun in 1943. Yeah. But we need to also give the Italians some credit here, because we're working with the fact that the Germans basically confiscated all of their other tanks. And we're not really giving the Italians much wiggle room here. That's one thing you'll notice with the Axis, and I think this is one of the biggest reasons why it fell, is none of the countries were able to work together with each other. It was a shit show. Now, this tank, the M15/42, had a 47mm, of course, the L40, and 4 8mm Beretta 38 machine guns. A little bit more when it came to anti-infantry. Now, the Italians were also trying to make a cruiser tank. This led to the M16/43, better known as the Carro Caleri Saraceno. I need to stop. Whenever I'm writing scripts, I need to, start actually figuring out how to pronounce these words. Which basically looks like the British Crusader. I mean, that's really it. Now, the low profile, the longer hull, and really the armament that was the same as the M14/42. They loved their 47mm. Now, it had a more powerful Fiat engine, and it could honestly get right around 44 to about 50 miles an hour, which is pretty good. For you uncivilized folk, that is 71 kilometers per hour. Now, the Italians canceled this And you'll start to see the Italians would make a design and then just cancel it out of nowhere. Now, the first tank that the Italians made that could really take on like a Sherman and such was a P-26/40. Had a 75mm gun away from the 47s, crazy, and a single 8mm Breda machine gun. The P-26/40 was supposed to be a heavy tank, and it really wasn't. It was about the same as a Sherman, really, in design, and it was a decent tank. Still had the riveted design. What is up with the Italians and the rivets, by the way? Just weld. The Italians did have an industry with welding. They had that. They could have at least done that. But, you know, I wasn't Mussolini. I wasn't him. I wasn't the one that was making the decisions. This also included something that was kind of new to Italian tanks, which was a two-man turret. You'll see the French early in the war like they're one-man turrets. Pretty much every French tank only needed a crew of two, which is good in some aspects. You lose a lot less men, but at the same time, your tank is operated a lot slower. But I digress. Now, the P-26/40 also had some things that were kind of taken from like the Panzer III, which is outdated by 1943. Yeah, so there's that. Very few of these were produced, and the Germans basically took what they could take. I can't find a lot of combat records of them at all. I would have loved to see one go against a Sherman, see how it does, but we don't really know. Now, let's get in a little bit into the flaws and the let's really just go into the pros and cons. The pros. Italy was working with the best that they had. They had decent tank crews, but they weren't really being trained well. They had about a seventh as much training time as the American and British crews. They were perfect if you were fighting in the Alps and in the mountains and such, places where you need lighter vehicles. They were perfect for that. But in North Africa, where you're fighting on flat terrain and you're taking on tanks with much better capabilities at long range, you're kind of screwed. Now, most of these tanks could really just be they could be knocked out by the QF 2-pounder, which is a 40mm. Now, when the 6-pounder came out, basically every Italian tank was done for once the 6-pounder really came around. But don't even get me started on the 17-pounder. I'm not even going to talk about it. Of course, it would destroy it. Now, let's talk a bit about really what's a good way to put it? The restrictions that Italy was dealing with. First thing, pretty much through most of the war, they were dealing with the threat of invasion. It was kind of understood that they were going to get invaded at some point. They didn't think it was going to be in the south initially, but you saw how it went. Now, Italy was really dealing with a lot, and they somehow managed to produce as many tanks as they did, but it wasn't nearly enough. Italy was really trying its best, and I think their tanks would have destroyed most other armies' tanks early in the war, but in the middle of the war, they couldn't do anything. Now, some of the Italian tanks that had the 47mm were doing decent in North Africa against Shermans and Stuarts and such, but that's about it. Even against some of the M2 mediums, that's all combat. I think that truly the Italians do deserve a bit of credit for trying. I think they deserve a gold star for that. You know, I think A for effort, that sort of thing. But they weren't the greatest. I'll say that at least. My defense is really in the fact of you got to hand it to them in the fact that they were really just doing their best with what they had. And I think that if the war had gone to the Alps or it would have been trench warfare, Italian tanks would shine. But of course, you know, this is an alternate history scenario if the war goes into the Alps and in the trenches again. But, you know, the Italians didn't really know what they were dealing with, and you got to hand it to them for at least trying their best. Now, that's about it when it comes to Italian tanks. I want to thank all of you guys for watching this video. I would appreciate any sort of criticism to my videos at all. I need advice. Any good topics that you think I should get into, anything like that, I'd love to talk about. But for now, I'll see y'all later. I'll catch you on the flip side. I am